Every mystery has a voice. Few dare to listen.
Lord Peter Wimsey objected first to the word silent. "It is a term," he observed mildly, "which ought never to be employed without a qualifying adverb. Silence, like virtue, is rarely absolute. One may have a guilty silence, a sulky silence, a reverential silence, or, most treacherous of all, a silence contrived with intent." Inspector Parker, who had heard this sort of thing before, and had learned to endure it with the patience of a man married to both duty and whimsy, merely grunted and turned his attention back to the body. The body lay at the foot of the narrow oak staircase in the south wing of Merriman House, arranged with a decorum that was at once shocking and faintly ridiculous. Mr. Alistair Fenwick, choirmaster, amateur medievalist, and the acknowledged tyrant of the Merriman parish carol tradition, had fallen or been placed with his head neatly aligned to the skirting board, his hands folded upon his chest as though awaiting resurrection, and his mouth open in an expression of surprised reproach. His eyes, however, were closed. "That," said Wimsey, peering down from the third step with the air of a man inspecting a dubious souffle, "is another point. People who fall downstairs do not generally compose themselves like effigies on a tomb. One expects a certain, how shall I put it, untidiness." Parker sighed. "You've been here 5 minutes. 7, Wimsey corrected gently. "I looked at my watch when I came in. Which, by the way, is 2 minutes fast, a habit acquired at Eton and never successfully shaken. One likes to be late with purpose, not by accident." Merriman House itself was doing its level best to look innocent. Built in the late Georgian period, and subsequently improved upon by several generations of owners with more money than taste, it sprawled comfortably above the village green like a well-fed cat. Its windows glowed with lamplight against the early December dusk, and a wreath of holly hung upon the front door with a cheerfulness that bordered on the indecent. Somewhere in the distance a bell was tolling, slowly, thoughtfully, and with an irritating lack of urgency. "That bell," said Wimsey suddenly. Parker looked up. "What about it?" "It's late," said Wimsey, "or early, one of the two. Merriman Church rings the quarter hours, does it not?" "Yes, and that," said Wimsey, "was neither a quarter nor an hour. More of a personal statement. Like a cough in the middle of a sermon." Parker stared at him. "Peter—" "Never mind," Wimsey said hastily. "A mere aesthetic grievance. Pray continue being official." The official account, such as it was, had arrived with brisk efficiency and very little imagination. Mr. Fenwick had been found just after 6 o'clock by Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, who had come to remind him, gently she said, that the rehearsal for the Christmas Eve carol service was to begin in half an hour. When he did not answer his door, she had assumed him to be sulking, a reasonable assumption, given his temperament, and had gone downstairs to wait. It was only upon returning, armed with a tray of tea and what she described as a conciliatory mince pie, that she discovered him at the foot of the stairs. Dead. No sound of a fall had been heard, no cry, no disturbance of any kind. It was as though, Mrs. Dalrymple had said, in a voice trembling with both awe and grievance, the house itself had swallowed the noise. Which was how the word silent had come to be used. Wimsey, who had been invited down to Merriman House under the agreeable pretext of a weekend visit, Fenwick having insisted upon his opinion regarding a disputed descant in a 15th-century carol, now found himself lingering at the edge of a crime scene with a cigarette he was not allowed to light and a mind that was already busily rearranging furniture. He bent down and examined the newel post. "Recently polished," he remarked. "Yes," said Parker. "The whole place is being done up for Christmas." "Ah," said Wimsey. "Christmas, peace on earth, goodwill to men, and an admirable season for murder. People are so busy being virtuous that they neglect to be careful." He straightened, brushed imaginary dust from his sleeve, and glanced up the staircase. "I suppose," he said lightly, "that everyone will tell us they know nothing at all." Parker nodded. "To a man—" "Splendid," said Wimsey. Then we shall have to listen very closely to what they say instead. Above them, the staircase rose in a narrow, curving throat of shadow, its carpet runner patterned with faded fleurs-de-lis. At the top, Mr. Fenwick's door stood ajar, just enough to suggest invitation, just enough to imply refusal, and somewhere in the house, quite unmistakably, someone was humming a carol, very softly, and very much out of tune. The humming stopped the moment Whimsy lifted his head. It was not, he reflected, the sort of silence one associates with innocence. It had the quality of a door being shut very carefully. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Parker nodded. "Mrs. Dalrymple says one of the maids has a habit of singing while she works." "Unfortunate habit," said Whimsy. "Carol singing should be communal or not at all. Solo efforts tend toward heresy." They moved away from the staircase and into the morning room, where the household had been assembled with. The anxious neatness of people who believed that order might substitute for explanation. The fire burned politely. A tray of untouched sherry glasses stood upon a side table. Outside the tall windows, the village green lay dim and frost-pricked, its Christmas tree a skeletal outline against the dark. Mrs. Dalrymple sat very upright on the edge of a chair, her hands folded as rigidly as the dead man's had been. She was a woman of indeterminate age, preserved by discipline and disapproval, with a face that suggested she had been born frowning and had never found reason to stop. Next to her perched Miss Evelyn Crane, the parlour-maid, whose eyes were red and whose nose bore the unmistakable sheen of recent tears, applied with enthusiasm rather than restraint. Behind them hovered Mrs. Fenwick, no relation to the deceased, but his widowed cousin and hostess, wrapped in a shawl and an expression of injured refinement. Further back, leaning against the mantel with an air of sullen detachment, stood Mr. Lionel Brooke, Fenwick's nephew and presumed heir, whose hands were thrust deep into his pockets as though he feared they might betray him. Whimsy surveyed them with mild interest. "Well," he said, "this is charming. Like a family portrait by Hogarth, only with better upholstery. Now, pray do not be alarmed. I should like to hear precisely what each of you was doing between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. There was a collective intake of breath, as though the room itself had been asked an indelicate question. Mrs. Dalrymple spoke first, with the air of one accustomed to beginning. "At 5:30 precisely, my lord, I was in the still-room, decanting the elderberry cordial. At 5:45 I took it upstairs to Mrs. Fenwick, who was resting. At 6 o'clock I returned to remind Mr. Fenwick about rehearsal." "And you heard nothing?" Whimsy asked. "Nothing at all," she said firmly. "Not a sound. Not even a thump." He suggested, "No, my lord." Whimsy nodded gravely, as though she had confirmed a suspicion rather than denied it. Miss Crane dabbed at her eyes and spoke next. "I was laying the supper table," she said, "in the dining room. I remember because the clock struck 6 just as I put down the last knife." "Which clock?" Whimsy asked. She blinked. "The dining-room clock, my lord." "Ah," said Whimsy, "the tall one with the moon dial. A charming piece. Does it keep good time?" I think so." Whimsy made a mental note to think otherwise. Mrs. Fenwick's account was delivered in a voice tremulous with self-pity. "I had a headache," she said. "Alistair's rehearsals are very trying, all that stopping and starting. He insists upon perfection. I was lying down. I heard nothing, not even the bell," Whimsy asked. "What bell?" "The church bell," said Whimsy. "It rang—" Mrs. Fenwick frowned. "I don't recall it." Mr. Brooke laughed shortly. "I heard the bell," he said. "I was outside, smoking. It rang just before 6, didn't it?" "I remember thinking it was odd." "Odd," repeated Whimsy. "Yes, that is the word." "And you?" Parker asked. Brooke shrugged. "I came in at 6, found everyone in a flap." "You did not go upstairs?" Whimsy asked mildly. "No, not even to see your uncle." Brooke's mouth tightened. "He wasn't my uncle. And no." Whimsy let the moment hang and smiled. "Of course," he said. "Forgive me. Family trees are such complicated growths." He wandered toward the window, peering out at the green. "And the door to Mr. Fenwick's room," he added casually. "It was ajar when you found him." "Yes," said Mrs. Dalrymple. "Just so, had it been open earlier. "No, my lord. Mr. Fenwick always shut it." "Drafts," he said, interfered with his pitch. "How very conscientious," murmured Whimsy. He turned back to the group. "Well," he said cheerfully, "this H has been most instructive. You have all been admirably unhelpful in precisely the same way." There was a stir of indignation. "I mean," he added hastily, "that you have all told me nothing at all, which is in its way quite remarkable. Silence, you see, is rarely accidental." He glanced once more toward the staircase, where the shadows seemed to deepen as the light failed. "And houses," he went on lightly, "do not swallow sounds. They merely redirect them. Somewhere above them a floorboard creaked, slowly, deliberately, like a footstep taken with care. The creak did not repeat itself. Whimsy waited, head slightly inclined, like a man listening for a misplayed note. When nothing followed, he smiled faintly and turned back to the assembled company. "Old houses," he said, "are like elderly relatives. They make noises at inconvenient moments and then deny all knowledge of them." Parker cleared his throat and began the formal dispersal, sending Mrs. Fenwick upstairs under escort, instructing Miss Crane to remain available, and advising Mr. Brooke, firmly but politely, not to leave the premises. Mrs. Dalrymple hovered, bristling with offended propriety, until Parker assured her that her assistance would be required later. Only then did she withdraw, stiff-backed, as though retreat were a personal insult. Left alone in the morning room, Whimsy wandered to the dining room. "Clark, would you mind," he asked Parker, "if I committed a small act of vandalism?" Without waiting for permission, he opened the tall case and peered inside. The pendulum swung with dignified regularity. The weights descended with all the confidence of long habit. 5 minutes slow, he announced, possibly 6, which means that when Miss Crane heard it strike 6, it was in fact nearer 10 past. Parker frowned. "That matters?" "It will," said Whimsy, closing the case gently. "Time is a terribly literal thing. One may argue with people, but not with minutes." They returned to the staircase. In the failing light, the runner looked darker than before, its pattern broken by a faint irregularity halfway down. Whimsy knelt. "A scuff," he said, "not a dramatic one. Heel, perhaps. Someone hesitated. On the stairs? Yes, or at least someone paused long enough to shift their weight. People who fall do not pause." Parker looked up the staircase. "You think he didn't fall?" "I think," said Whimsy, "that he may have been persuaded." They went up. Mr. Fenwick's room smelled faintly of beeswax and something sharper, ink perhaps, or old paper. A desk stood by the window, its surface neatly arranged, a sheaf of music, a leather-bound notebook, a ruler placed with almost military precision. The bed was untouched. Whimsy crossed to the window and opened it an inch. "Cold," he remarked. "And yet the room is warm. Curious." He bent to examine the sill. "Footprints?" Parker suggested. "No," said Whimsy. "Dust disturbance. Someone stood here recently. Not long enough to leave a mark, but long enough to consider it." "Consider what?" "Escape," said Whimsy lightly. "Or performance." He turned to the desk and picked up the notebook. "May I?" Parker nodded. Whimsy flipped through the pages. They were filled with cramped, precise handwriting, musical notation interspersed with Latin phrases, some crossed out with angry strokes. "He was revising something," Whimsy murmured. "Not music. Words." He paused at a page where a carol text had been altered again and again, the final version written with such pressure that the pen had nearly torn the paper. "Silent night," he read softly. "Holy night." He seems to have objected to the adjective. Parker glanced at him. "You're making jokes." "On the contrary," said Whimsy, "I am being serious. Mr. Fenwick was a man who cared deeply about accuracy. Abo, UT control. People like that do not die by accident." He closed the notebook and replaced it exactly as he had found it. As they turned to leave, Whimsy paused by the door. "Inspector," he said, "did anyone mention locking this door?" Parker shook his head. "No. Interesting," said Whimsy. "Because it locks from the outside." Parker stared at him. "And," Whimsy added gently, "it is locked now." Parker tested the handle again, as though the door might reconsider its position under pressure. It did not. "That's not possible," he said. "We came in through the other door," said Whimsy, "the communicating one. A charming convenience. Also a trap for the unwary." He stepped back, examining the lock with affectionate attention. "Clean," he observed. "Recently oiled. Someone anticipated use." Parker's mouth hardened. "Then whoever locked it was inside with him. Or," said Whimsy pleasantly, "had been inside shortly before, and wished to suggest that no one had been inside at all. Locks are very moral objects. They exist to reassure." They went back down, the staircase now wearing an air of faint reproach, as though offended by their scrutiny. At the foot, Parker paused. "I'll have the door forced," he said. "Not yet," Whimsy replied. "Let it enjoy its mystery a little longer. There are other amusements to be had." Those amusements arrived promptly in the form of Dr. Hargreaves, the village physician, whose manner combined professional briskness with a relish for being consulted. He delivered his verdict with confidence. "Death by cervical fracture," he said. The neck snapped cleanly. "A fall would do it, would it?" said Whimsy. Hargreaves frowned. "Certainly, provided sufficient force and sufficient height," Whimsy added. "How many steps, Inspector?" 14, and carpeted," said Whimsy, "with a runner of admirable thickness. Forgive me, Doctor, but I should be inclined to expect bruising, a little chaos." "Mr. Fenwick appears to have died with remarkable tidiness." "Shock can do wonders," said Hargreaves stiffly. "So can assistance," said Whimsy. The doctor sniffed and departed, offended. By the time supper was announced, no one having had the heart to cancel it, suspicion had found a convenient resting place. Mr. Lionel Brooke, with his ill-timed laughter, his acknowledged resentment of Fenwick's authority, and his presence on the grounds at the critical moment, made an excellent candidate. Parker questioned him again in the library. "You disliked him," Parker said. Brooke did not deny it. "He was unbearable, treated everyone like a delinquent chorister. You argued with him this afternoon, yes. About money, yes. And you expected to inherit." Brooke's eyes flickered. "Eventually. That's motive enough," Parker said. Whimsy, lounging by the shelves and examining a row of theological treatises with mild distaste, said nothing at all. Brooke noticed. "What?" he demanded. "You think I did it too?" Whimsy turned, smiling. "My dear sir," he said, "I think you are exactly the sort of person one would expect to have done it, and therefore the least interesting. Murder, like art, requires a certain imagination." Brooke flushed. "You're making sport of this." "God forbid," said Whimsy. "I am merely being amused." He drifted away, leaving Parker to his interrogation, and found Mrs. Dalrymple in the pantry, rearranging plates with unnecessary vigor. "A question," Whimsy said gently. "How long have you been with the family?" 23 years, she replied. "And never a death under this roof before?" "Never," he echoed. "And the stairs, have they always been carpeted?" "Yes, my lord, since before my time." "And the runner, was it ever moved?" She hesitated. "Only for a fraction of a second. Not to my knowledge. Of course not, Cy." "D. Whimsy. And the curtains in the south wing, do they muffle sound?" She stiffened. "They're velvet." "Ah," said Whimsy. "Velvet. An excellent absorber. One might shout oneself hoarse behind velvet and be heard not at all." Her lips tightened. Whimsy thanked her and moved on, humming softly, quite deliberately out of tune. Later, as the household settled into a strained semblance of normality, Whimsy stood alone at the foot of the stairs, gazing upward. He took out his watch, compared it with the hall clock, and smiled faintly. 6 minutes, he murmured. Consistently, he tapped the newel post with his knuckle. The sound was dull, swallowed almost at once. "Yes," he said softly, "very silent indeed." Above him, somewhere in the house, a door closed, not slammed, not hurried, but with the careful finality of someone who believed themselves unobserved. Whimsy did not look up at the sound of the closing door. He listened instead, head tilted, counting silently, not seconds, but reverberations. There were none. "Velvet again," he murmured. or habit? He went at last to his room, where Bunter had already laid out his evening things with the air of a man who disapproved of disorder but tolerated murder as an occupational hazard. "Anything particular, my lord?" Bunter asked, smoothing an imaginary crease from a jacket that had never known one. "Nothing whatever," said Whimsy. "Which is to say, everything. Tell me, Bunter, have you noticed whether the clocks in this house agree with one another?" Bunter allowed himself a pause of exactly the right length. "They do not, my lord. By how much?" "The hall clock is slow by approximately 6 minutes. The dining-room clock by somewhat more. Mrs. Fenwick's travelling clock appears to be accurate." "Excellent," said Whimsy. "One likes a reliable liar in a roomful of unreliable ones. At dinner the atmosphere was one of strained civility. Thank you, as though everyone were attending a funeral rehearsal and hoping fervently not to be cast. Conversation stumbled and recovered, only to falter again. Mr. Brooke drank too much wine and too quickly. Miss Crane scarcely touched her plate. Mrs. Dalrymple presided with grim determination, serving courses as though punctuality might yet redeem the day. Whimsy ate with appetite and listened. At a lull, he remarked conversationally, "Extraordinary thing, sound. One never quite knows where it will go." No one responded. "In Oxford," he continued, "there is a staircase in Balliol where a whisper at the bottom may be heard clearly at the top, while a shout goes nowhere at all. Architecture has its little jokes." Mrs. Fenwick stirred uneasily. "I don't like houses with tricks," she said. "Nor do I," said Whimsy. "They make liars of honest people." After dinner, Parker joined Whimsy in the hall. "I've spoken to the vicar," Parker said. "The bell rang at 5:54. He checked his watch. Whimsy smiled. "A man after my own heart." And Brooke's statement still holds. "He was outside until 6. "Outside," said Whimsy. "Yes, a useful word." "Outside where?" Parker frowned. "The terrace, which overlooks the south wing windows," said Whimsy, "including Mr. Fenwick's." "You think—" "I think," said Whimsy, "that we are being offered a very neat little box. And neatness in murder is always suspicious." They climbed the stairs again, this time together, and stopped halfway. "Stand there," Whimsy said, indicating a spot near the scuff on the runner, "and speak." Parker obliged. "Halloo!" The sound died almost at once. Whimsy moved 2 steps higher. Again, "Halloo!" This time, faintly, a whisper of sound crept upward, as though reluctantly admitted. "Now," said Whimsy, "imagine someone standing at the top, and someone else here. One might converse if one were discreet, or argue." "Ooh, and if one fell," Parker said. "One would make a noise," said Whimsy. "Unless one were already, shall we say, incapable of protest." They went up to the landing. Whimsy paused by the velvet curtains that hung thickly along the wall and drew one aside. Behind it, a narrow servants' passage ran parallel to the stairs, terminating in a small door. "Ah," said Whimsy softly, "there you are." The door was unlocked. Beyond it lay a short flight of steps leading directly to the foot of the main staircase. "A private route," Parker said. "A very considerate one," said Whimsy, "for anyone wishing to arrive unheard." Parker looked grim. "This changes things. It simplifies them," said Whimsy. "We have motive enough, opportunity enough, and now a method that explains our silence." "But who?" Parker demanded. Whimsy reached out and touched the velvet curtain again, thoughtfully. "Someone," he said, "who knew the house intimately. Someone who understood its habits. Someone who could stand close enough to be heard, and close enough to persuade." He glanced at his watch. "And someone," he added, "who is very shortly going to make a mistake. Because it is nearly time for what? For the carol rehearsal," said Whimsy. "Which, murder or no murder, Mr. Fenwick would never have allowed to be late." From somewhere below, a voice called, tentative, uncertain, "My lord, Inspector." Miss Crane stood at the foot of the stairs, twisting her hands. "Mrs. Dalrymple says—" She swallowed. "She says the music has gone missing. Mr. Fenwick's book." Whimsy's eyes brightened. "Just a little. Indeed, he said. Then we had better all go and sing. They gathered in the music room with the air of conspirators summoned under false pretenses. The piano stood open, its keys yellowed with age, the lid casting a long shadow like a raised eyebrow. Candles had been lit against the deepening gloom, their flay. Mares wavering in the draughts that crept invisibly through the old house. The absence of Mr. Fenwick's meticulous presence was felt at once, like a wrong note sustained too long. Mrs. Dalrymple hovered near the door, her mouth set in a line of offended duty. "The book was here this afternoon," she said, "on the stand. I saw it myself." "And now it is not," said Whimsy pleasantly. "Books, like people, sometimes take it into their heads to wander. Let us hope it has not come to a bad end." Miss Crane sat at the piano, her fingers resting uncertainly on the keys. "I don't know what to play," she whispered. "Anything," said Whimsy, "provided it is inoffensive and slightly dull. Mr. Fenwick would have hated it." She managed a thin smile and began to pick out a carol, hesitant, uneven, but recognizable. The sound crept into the room and seemed to cling to the walls, as though uncertain of its welcome. Whimsy stood near the back, listening, not to the music, but to the spaces between it. He watched the faces instead. Mrs. Fenwick stared fixedly at the floor. Mr. Brooke leaned against the mantel again, arms folded now, his foot tapping in a rhythm that did not quite match the tune. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips moved silently, counting beats. At the second verse, Whimsy spoke. "Do go on," he said mildly. "I find repetition soothing." Miss Crane obeyed, her voice gaining a little strength. As she sang, Whimsy drifted toward the side door, the one that led by a discreet turn into the servants' passage. He opened it quietly. The sound changed at once. From the passage, the music was clearer, unmistakably so. Words emerged, thin but intelligible, like a message carried through a speaking tube. Whimsy closed the door again and returned to his place. "Thank you," he said when the verse ended. "That will do admirably." Parker looked at him. "What are you playing at?" "A round," said Whimsy. More senses than one." He addressed the room. Mr. Fenwick was a man who believed in order, he said, in precision, in being heard. He chose this room because its acoustics were honest. "Sing here, and you are heard everywhere you ought to be, and nowhere you ought not." Mrs. Dalrymple stiffened. "But the staircase," Whimsy went on, "is a liar. It swallows sound from one direction and passes it along another. A useful property, if one wishes to argue privately, or to ensure that an argument is not overheard." Brooke laughed shortly. "You're talking nonsense." "Am I?" said Whimsy. "Then perhaps you will explain why Mr. Fenwick's music book was removed." No one spoke. "Because," Whimsy continued, "it contained something he had no intention of sharing. Not music, words. A revision, a correction." He turned to Mrs. Fenwick. "Your cousin was altering the text of the final carol," he said gently, "restoring an older version, one that removed a dedication." Her head jerked up. "That's absurd." "Is it?" said Whimsy. "The dedication to your late husband, added some years ago, a sentimental flourish." Mr. Fenwick, with his passion for accuracy, discovered that it was spurious. Worse, deliberate. She stared at him, color draining from her face. "He meant to remove it," Whimsy said. "Tonight. Publicly. A small thing, perhaps, but humiliating. And it would have raised questions about authorship, about money." Brooke shifted. "What money?" "The trust," said Whimsy. "Left to the parish choir in your husband's name, administered by Mr. Fenwick, to be dissolved if the dedication were proved false." Mrs. Dalrymple made a small sound in her throat. "You knew," said Whimsy softly. "You helped her. You moved the runner once, didn't you? For cleaning. You learned the house's little tricks." "That's a lie," she said hoarsely. "Is it?" said Whimsy. "Then how did you hear him argue on the sty?" "R.S. from the passage." Through the velvet, Parker stepped forward. "Mrs. Dalrymple," she broke then. Not with tears, but with fury. He was going to ruin her, she said, after all these years. He stood there, correcting her, as though she were a child. "And you pushed him," said Whimsy quietly. "I didn't mean—" Her voice failed. "He fell so easily." "No," said Whimsy. He didn't fall. He was already dead. You broke his neck at the top. Then you placed him. You folded his hands. You locked the door. You made it tidy." Silence followed. Real silence, heavy and undeniable. Parker took her arm. As she was led away, Whimsy looked once more at the piano. "A pity," he said. He would have hated that ending. Later, as the house settled into a quieter order, Parker found Whimsy in the hall, lighting a cigarette at last. "You were very sure," Parker said. Whimsy smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I was merely listening." Parker did not answer at once. He watched the smoke curl upward and disperse into the shadowed rafters, as though reluctant to leave. "You said she broke his neck at the top," he said at last. Hargreaves was quite clear. The injury was consistent with a fall. Whimsy smiled without amusement. "Doctors," he said, "are like theologians. They reason admirably within the bounds of their own assumptions." He moved toward the staircase again, slower now, as though the house had earned a measure of respect. "A fall could have done it," he went on, "but it need not have." A sharp twist, delivered decisively, would produce the same result. What mattered was not the mechanism, but the moment. He died before he ever reached the first step. Parker frowned. "Then why the stairs at all?" "Because," said Whimsy, "death is rarely enough. People want a story. Mrs. Dalrymple wanted an accident, something clean, impersonal. She gave him gravity as an accomplice." They stood in silence. CE for a moment. Then Parker said, "There's something else." "Of course there is," said Whimsy cheerfully. "There always is." "The music book," Parker continued. "We found it—" Whimsy turned. "Where?" "In the vestry. Behind the organ." "Ah," said Whimsy. "Then she meant to finish what she started." Parker nodded. "She must have taken it there earlier. Before 6. Which means," said Whimsy softly, "that she expected him to live long enough to be disgraced." They went together to the vestry. The church was cold and smelled faintly of dust and extinguished candles. Parker opened the book and laid it on the lectern. Whimsy leaned over it, reading silently. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its lightness. "She didn't alter the dedication," he said. "She wrote it." Parker looked up sharply. "In her hand," Whimsy continued, "years ago, for Mrs. Fenwick, who could not manage Latin and wished very much to appear capable of it. Fenwick discovered the truth last week. He told her he would correct it." "And the trust?" Parker asked. "Would have collapsed," said Whimsy, "not because of the words themselves, but because of the lie behind them. Mrs. Dalrymple knew. She had always known. She kept the accounts. She watched the money pass through her hands." Parker closed the book slowly. "So she wasn't protecting Mrs. Fenwick?" "No," said Whimsy. "She was protecting herself. Loyalty is a convenient word. It covers a multitude of sins." They returned to the house as the night deepened. Mrs. Fenwick had retired, pale and silent, to her room. Mr. Brooke had been sent away under supervision, his innocence now rendered merely tiresome. Miss Crane sat alone in the music room, staring at the piano as though it had betrayed her. Whimsy paused in the doorway. "You sang very well," he said kindly. She looked up, startled. "I was terrified. An excellent qualification," said Whimsy. "It sharpens the ear." She hesitated. "I heard them," she said suddenly. "On the stairs. I thought I imagined it." "Many people do," said Whimsy. "That is how houses get away with things." Later still, when the house had settled into a weary quiet, Parker found Whimsy standing once more at the foot of the staircase. "You were wrong about one thing," Parker said. "Oh?" Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "You said someone was going to make a mistake because it was nearly time." Whimsy smiled faintly. "And was I wrong?" Parker looked up at the stairs, at the velvet curtains, at the obedient shadows. "No," he said. "You were right. She couldn't bear to let the carol go unsung." Whimsy nodded. "Silence," he said, "is hardest to maintain when one has been listening all one's life." The formalities were carried out with the subdued efficiency of people eager to be finished with the day. Statements were taken again, more carefully this time, with fewer assumptions and longer pauses. Mrs. Dalrymple, once the spine of the household, now sat wrapped in a borrowed shawl. answering questions in a flat, exhausted voice as though the effort of sustaining order had finally exceeded its reward. Whimsy did not attend the interview. He remained instead in the music room, turning pages of Fenwick's scattered manuscripts with a curious gentleness, as though afraid they might resent his touch. Parker joined him there later, closing the door quietly behind him. "She signed," Parker said. "Not a full confession. She still insists it was an accident. But enough." Whimsy nodded. "They always do. Words like accident and mistake are the last refuges of intention." Parker hesitated. "There's one thing that still troubles me, the timing. She says the argument happened just before the bell rang, but the vicar was quite certain. 5:54. "Yes," said Whimsy, "and the hall clock was slow by 6 minutes. Parker stared at him. "You mean—" "I mean," said Whimsy, "that Mrs. Dalrymple told the truth as she experienced it. She heard the bell after the argument. She believed the time to be later than it was. The house conspired with her." "How?" "The clocks," said Whimsy, "all wrong in different ways, enough to blur certainty. Fenwick corrected texts. She corrected time. Between them, reality didn't stand a chance." Parker rubbed his forehead. "You noticed all that almost at once?" "No," said Whimsy quietly. "I noticed the possibility at once. Certainty is a slower business." He closed the manuscript and set it aside. "Fenwick was not an easy man," he went on, "but he was an honest one. He believed that if something was wrong, it must be corrected, no matter how long it had been accepted. Mrs. Dalrymple believed that if something had been accepted long enough, it became right. Those philosophies were bound to collide." "And Mrs. Fenwick?" Parker asked. "A bystander," said Whimsy. "A beneficiary, certainly, but not a conspirator. She allowed herself to be protected, and that was her sin. A small one, perhaps. But small sins have a way of recruiting larger ones." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Parker said, "You never accused her directly, not until the end." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Accusation is a blunt instrument. I prefer invitations. To sing, to listen," said Whimsy. "People reveal themselves when they believe the moment requires participation." Outside, the wind had risen, stirring the bare branches against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck, hesitantly, as though unsure of its authority. "Will you give evidence?" Parker asked. "Reluctantly," said Whimsy. "I dislike explaining things that ought to have been overheard." He reached for his coat. "Come," he added. "I should like one last look at the stairs." They went together to the south wing. In, the full light now, the staircase looked almost banal. Polished wood, obedient carpet, velvet curtains hanging with funereal dignity. Whimsy laid a hand on the newel post. "This," he said, "is where it ended. But not where it began." "Where then?" "In the still room," said Whimsy, "with accounts, with ink, with the slow accumulation of small dishonesties that require ever larger silences to conceal them." Parker nodded slowly. As they turned away, Whimsy paused. "One more thing," he said. "Have the bells rung again?" "No." "Good," said Whimsy. "Then perhaps the house is finished speaking." They left Merriman House just before dawn. Frost silvered the green, and the Christmas tree stood pale and undecorated against the paling sky. Whimsy paused at the gate and looked back once. "A pity," he said lightly. "It had excellent acoustics." Parker smiled despite himself. "You'll be glad to be rid of it." "Oh no," said Whimsy. "I shall miss it. Houses that keep secrets are always instructive. They remind one that silence is never empty. It is merely waiting to be interpreted." He turned up his collar against the cold and walked on, humming very softly and very deliberately out of tune. The drive back toward the village was slow, the road glazed with frost and the hedgerows breathing out a pale mist. Whimsy sat with his hat tilted low, watching the hedges slide past as though they were stage scenery being struck after a performance. Parker drove without speaking for several minutes. "You never explained," Parker said at last, "how you knew it was Mrs. Dalrymple and not Mrs. Fenwick." "Everyone assumed." "That devotion implies innocence," said Whimsy. "A common error. Devotion is far more dangerous than greed. Greed is honest about its appetites." Parker waited. "She was the only one," Whimsy continued, "who spoke of silence as though it were a virtue. Mrs. Fenwick spoke of rest. Miss Crane of fear. Brooke of inconvenience. But Mrs. Dalrymple spoke as though the absence of sound was something she had managed. "That's thin," Parker said. "Quite," said Whimsy cheerfully, "which is why I didn't rely upon it. I relied upon the clocks." The clocks again. Yes, she tended them. She knew which were wrong and by how much. When people lie about time, Inspector, they almost always borrow their lies from something already unreliable. She didn't invent 6 o'clock. She inherited it. Parker slowed as they approached the village. "And the bell?" "Ah," said Whimsy. "The bell was the only honest thing in the affair. It rang when it rang. Everything else shifted around it." They stopped outside the police station. Parker switched off the engine but did not get out. "She still insists," he said, "that she didn't mean to kill him." Whimsy's expression hardened a little. "No one ever does," he said. "Intention is a retrospective luxury. At the moment of action, people tell themselves they are merely preventing something. Preventing disgrace. Preventing exposure," said Whimsy. "Which is much the same thing to those who have lived by concealment." Parker opened the door. "She asked for you," he said. "Before we left." Whimsy hesitated only a moment, then nodded. Mrs. Dalrymple sat in a small interview room, her hands folded now not with discipline but with fatigue. She looked older, shrunken, as though the removal of her authority had reduced her physical substance. "You wanted to speak to me," Whimsy said gently. She looked up. "I wanted to know," she said. "When you knew," Whimsy considered. "When you corrected Miss Crane about the tempo," he said. "You were right, of course. But Mr. Fenwick was not there to insist upon it. Yet you insisted anyway. You were keeping him alive." Her mouth trembled. "He would have ruined everything," she said. "All those hours gone. For a footnote. For the truth," said Whimsy. She laughed softly. "Truth is a luxury for people who can afford it." "Perhaps," said Whimsy, "but lies are very expensive. They require constant maintenance." She looked at him steadily. "You enjoyed it," she said. "Catching me." "No," said Whimsy quietly. "I enjoyed understanding you. That is not the same thing." She closed her eyes. When he left the station, the village was fully awake. Shop windows were being dressed with tinsel. A group of children dragged a reluctant fir tree across the green. Life, he reflected, had an indecent habit of resuming itself. Parker joined him outside. "That's it then," Parker said. "For the law," said Whimsy. "Yes. And for you?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "For me," he said, "it will end when I stop hearing that bell." As if summoned, the church bell rang. This time properly, confidently, on the quarter hour. Whimsy listened, then nodded. "There," he said. "That sounds like an ending." They walked on together, leaving behind the house that had swallowed sound and learned, too late, how little silence could truly conceal. They parted at the corner of the green, Parker turning back toward the station, Whimsy setting off on foot with the unhurried air of a man who had nowhere in particular to be and intended to enjoy it. The frost had begun to soften under a pale winter sun, and the village smelled faintly of damp earth and pine needles. Somewhere a gramophone was playing, valiantly attempting cheer. Whimsy paused outside the church and went in. The nave was empty, save for the verger, who was polishing brass with the air of a man determined to restore moral order by elbow grease. Whimsy sat in a pew near the back and listened. The building had its own acoustics, honest ones. A cough here was a cough everywhere. A footstep announced itself without subterfuge. "Good morning, my lord," said the verger, recognizing him with respectful curiosity. "Good morning," said Whimsy. "I was wondering, has anyone been at the organ this morning?" "No, my lord. Pity," said Whimsy. "I should have liked to hear how it behaves when it tells the truth." He rose and wandered toward the vestry door, laying his hand briefly on the wood. "Sound," he murmured, "is an excellent moralist. It refuses to be where it has no business." Outside again, he encountered Miss Crane, who was hurrying across the green with a parcel under her arm. "Oh, my lord," she said, stopping short. I wanted to thank you." "For the singing?" he asked. "For listening," she said simply. He bowed. One does what one can. She hesitated. Will they still have the carol service? Yes, said Whimsy. With luck, it may even be improved by the absence of pedantry. She smiled, relieved, and went on her way. Whimsy walked back toward Merriman House one last time, not entering but circling it at a respectful distance. In daylight, it looked smaller, more ordinary, stripped of its nocturnal authority. The south wing windows reflected the sky innocently enough. Well, he said aloud, you did your best. The house did not reply. Bunter met him at the gate, impeccably punctual. The car is ready, my lord. Excellent. And have you secured us a quiet lunch? Yes, my lord. No music. A mercy, said Whimsy. As they drove away, the bell rang again, steady, accurate, and entirely without drama. Whimsy smiled and leaned back, closing his eyes. One must forgive houses, he said lazily. They are built to contain people, and people are terribly noisy things. Silence, when it appears, is almost always borrowed. Bunter said nothing, which was precisely right. The village receded, the road unwound, and Merriman House slipped into the landscape like a held breath finally released. Whimsy hummed under it all, a fragment. T of carol corrected just enough to satisfy him, and allowed the sound to fade naturally, without forcing it into silence. The drive carried them past the frozen hedgerows, the road glinting faintly in the weak winter sun. Whimsy reclined in his seat, eyes half closed, not asleep but savoring the kind of calm that follows a long, exacting puzzle solved. Bunter drove in silence, accustomed to his lordship's post-investigative reveries. Parker, in the back, fidgeted with the edge of his notebook, as though unwilling to let the case truly conclude. You'll never stop listening, will you? Parker said finally. Not listening, Whimsy corrected gently. Merely observing. One hears a great deal more when one understands that silence is never empty. It has meaning, and people are rather predictable if one is patient. Parker frowned. And Mrs. Dalrymple? She will live with her conscience, said Whimsy, a sturdy companion in its way, more persistent than any vicar or constable. She will remember the stairs, the passage, the book, and the bell, and she will think carefully before she ever trusts silence again. That is justice enough for a life otherwise spared. The carriage turned onto the main street, and the village square unfolded before them. Frost still rimmed the lamp-posts, and the morning bustle was beginning. A baker arranging his loaves, a grocer unpacking crates of oranges, children chasing one another with shrieks that the winter air did nothing to soften. The ordinary world had resumed, oblivious to the meticulous drama that had played out in the south wing of Merriman House. People, said Whimsy, leaning slightly forward, are far more dramatic than they suspect. They perform great tragedies in rooms no one sees, and their audience is often themselves. It is curious, is it not, how the smallest lie can demand so much labor to sustain it. Parker tapped his N. Notebook. And yet the house, Merriman House I mean, it played a part. The passage, the staircase, the velvet curtains, all that assisted her deception. Ah, but she understood them, said Whimsy, not the house itself. Houses are impartial, though they are excellent accessories. One uses them, or one is undone by them. You see, Inspector, the physical world is far more literal than human intentions. A door doesn't lie, a bell doesn't cheat, people do. And that is why observation, careful and patient, is worth more than interrogation alone. They passed the church, the bell still ringing with satisfying certainty. Whimsy looked up at it, lips twitching in faint amusement. Music, architecture, and time, he murmured, all conspiring to tell truth if only we listen closely enough. And yet, people are clever. They attempt to hide behind everything. Even silence, if you are careless, becomes an accomplice. Parker shook his head. You make it sound so simple, yet every detail seems designed to confuse. Designed to confuse, said Whimsy with a dry smile, or to protect vanity. But human nature is consistent, and vanity is remarkably predictable. One must simply allow it to reveal itself. It does so obligingly if one is patient. One merely needs to be listening, not assuming. The village receded behind them as the road wound onward toward London. Whimsy leaned back, hands folded, watching the sunlight glinting off the frost. The world ahead was ordinary, safe, and entirely unaware of the subtle theatre that had taken place among its quiet streets and frozen hedgerows. And that, he reflected, was precisely as it should be. "One day," he said softly, "we will find a silence that cannot be interpreted, but I suspect that will not be today, or any day soon." Bunter glanced at him through the corner of his eye. Whimsy, serene and slightly smug, hummed again, an off-key. Correct. Ive fragment of carol that was somehow entirely perfect for the moment. And as they drove, the winter sun glinted off the frost, casting long, delicate shadows, while the echoes of Merriman House and its silent secrets lingered quietly behind them, already fading into memory. By the time they reached London, the low sun had turned the frost to a shimmering watery silver, and the city smelled of coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint tang of industry waking. Whimsy alighted at his flat, Bunter following with quiet efficiency, and Parker with the lingering weight of an unresolved sense of admiration. The case formally was closed, but as always, Whimsy treated closure as a polite suggestion rather than an imperative. He moved to the window and gazed across the street at the ordinary comings and goings, a milkman, a postman, a small boy chasing a hoop. They were unaware, as most people always are, that the world is threaded with subtle orders and hidden consequences. A stray bell in a distant village, a velvet curtain, a misaligned clock. All had conspired to reveal the character of a woman who might otherwise have passed unremarked. "Bunter," he said, pulling off his gloves, "bring me the papers and something light to eat. We shall do nothing very quickly, but it is essential to appear occupied." "Yes, my lord," said Bunter, dutiful as ever. Parker lingered near the doorway. "You ever tire of it?" he asked quietly. Whimsy turned, smiling faintly. "Tire of observation? Never. Tiring is for the impatient and the inattentive. One does not tire of listening. One tires only of people who do not speak honestly. And they, Inspector, are invariably quite talkative once one knows how to listen." The inspector shook his head, a mixture of frustration and wonder on his face. "I suppose that is why you enjoy it so." "Precisely," said Whimsy. "It is a game, but a game of patience, deduction, and subtlety. It rewards no one for haste, and punishes sloppiness with exquisite severity. And," he paused, leaning back, "it is occasionally amusing, which is a mercy." Parker, satisfied for the moment, took his leave, muttering something about reports and paperwork. Bunter returned with tea, setting it down with a practiced flourish. Whimsy accepted it, lifting the cup delicately, and then sat back to reflect. The case of Merriman House would linger in memory not because of the crime itself, though a broken neck and the staging of an accident were dramatic enough, but because of its architecture, its silent complicity, the moral theatre played out among velvet curtains, narrow passages, and clocks that refused agreement. Every detail had spoken. Once he had learned to interpret the language of houses, furniture, and human caution. He sipped his tea, eyes half closed, and allowed himself a small smile. "One may close a case," he murmured, "but one never closes entirely the lesson it offers. Timing, motive, opportunity, and curiosity. Curiosity is always the most useful weapon. Outside, London hummed with ordinary life. Inside, in the quiet of the flat, Whimsy considered the moral rhythm of the past week, the argument, the scuff, the clocks, the removed music book, the velvet curtains, the final carol. Each had been a note in a sequence that, in the hands of the inattentive, would have been meaningless. In the hands of someone patient enough to listen, it became a revelation. He set down the cup, tapping a finger lightly on the saucer. A faint arch amusement touched his lips. "And so," he murmured to no one in particular, "we leave silence to its devices. It is never empty. It merely waits to be understood." Bunter cleared the tray and left the room, closing the door behind him. Whimsy remained at the window, looking out at the grey afternoon, content to hay. are the city's many small noises, and in them the echo of lessons learned, mysteries solved, and the satisfaction that for all its subtleties, the world could still be deciphered. One sound, one misaligned clock, and one honest observation at a time. And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey allowed himself to rest, knowing that while Merriman House's secrets had been revealed, there would always be another house, another silence, and another carefully concealed truth awaiting him somewhere just beyond the frost and the ordinary noise of life. Even as the winter afternoon deepened into early evening, Wimsey remained at his window, the city outside muted beneath a layer of frost and smoke. The street lamps had begun to glow faintly, halos of yellow against the dimming sky, and the muffled rumble of traffic hinted at lives proceeding in oblivion to the subtleties of human deception he had just unraveled. He rested his chin lightly on his hand, allowing his thoughts to drift, not idly, but with the quiet, precise attention of a mind accustomed to assembling puzzles from fragments. Bunter returned, carrying a small bundle of letters that had arrived during the day. Wimsey took them without looking, separating them by weight and paper quality with a sort of casual ritual. Some were invitations, others requests for advice, and one bore the familiar seal of the Diogenes Club. He placed it aside for the moment. Even his curiosity could wait. First, there was reflection to be done. The odd thing, he murmured to no one, is that Mrs. Dalrymple never lied outright. She arranged, concealed, and misdirected, but she never invented. That is why she failed to fool the observant. He smiled faintly, a dry arch of amusement curling his lips. It is a common error among clever people. They overestimate the power of subtlety when one is dealing with someone trained to see patterns, rather than mere gestures. From the window, he observed a child trying to catch a falling snowflake on his tongue. There was a brief flash of delight on the boy's face as the ice melted, unnoticed by the rushing adults. Wimsey allowed himself the comparison. The unnoticed, the small, and the fleeting could yield more insight than any overt action if one was patient enough to observe. He set down the letters and turned to the fire, where the last embers of a dying coal glowed like tiny coals of thought waiting to ignite. Bunter cleared his throat. "Shall I prepare dinner, my lord?" "Yes, Bunter. And something light, please. One cannot think well on a heavy meal, and reflection requires nourishment of a subtler sort." He paused, watching the embers. "It is curious. The house is quiet, the case closed, yet I feel as if Merriman House still whispers. Not in sound, but in memory. Its secrets have been revealed, but the lessons endure." Bunter inclined his head respectfully. "Shall I bring your pipe as well?" "Indeed," said Wimsey. "I may yet wish to contemplate the anatomy of silence." He allowed a small, arch smile. "And perhaps rehearse in my mind the timing of clocks and steps, just to ensure I have not overlooked some trivial misalignment. It is often in the trivial that the profound resides." He settled into his chair, pipe in hand, and let the quiet of the room settle around him. Outside, the bells of another church began to toll, their measured clangs marking the hour. Wimsey listened, noting the precision, the inevitability of their rhythm, and the stark contrast with human deception. He inhaled from the pipe, the smoke curling upward like wisps of contemplation, and allowed himself the faintest flicker of amusement. "People," he murmured, "will always attempt to hide themselves behind their houses, their words, their timepieces. But one learns in the end that every secret has a sound, every lie an echo. One need only know how to hear it." And with that, the city continuing its indifferent hum outside, Wimsey allowed the warmth of the room and the quiet satisfaction of understanding to settle over him. Merriman House was behind him, its story told, yet its lessons were carried forward, not in noise, not in evidence, but in the patient attention to the subtleties that only the observant could ever hope to interpret. In that moment, the case was concluded, the culprit known, and the intricate ballet of deception unraveled, leaving only the lingering, instructive whisper of truth. The days following the resolution of the Merriman House affair passed quietly, almost deceptively so. Mrs. Dalrymple had been taken into custody, her account of events reluctantly corroborated, and the parish choir carried on with its rehearsals, unconcerned by the moral dramas that had unfolded in the south wing. Mrs. Fenwick, pale and subdued, but no longer under immediate threat of public humiliation, gradually returned to her accustomed routines, carefully avoiding the spaces where the memory of her cousin's actions lingered. Miss Crane, steadier now, resumed her lessons with the piano, occasionally casting a wary glance at the velvet curtains as though expecting them to whisper again. For Lord Peter Wimsey, the case had been a study in the subtleties of human behavior, in the minute rhythms of houses, the deliberate misalignment of clocks, and the precise manipulation of silence. He reflected on it with the quiet satisfaction of one who has observed a pattern that others could not. Where deception had seemed impenetrable, he had traced its faintest echoes and revealed the underlying truth. Sitting in his study one afternoon, pipe in hand and the faint sunlight slanting across the bookshelves, Wimsey mused to Bunter, who hovered with the unobtrusive attentiveness of a man who had long learned the difference between presence and interference. "One might think," he said thoughtfully, "that houses, like people, conceal themselves behind appearances. But if you listen, even the quietest corners will speak." "They always do." Bunter inclined his head. "Shall we expect any more surprises, my lord?" "Not today, Bunter," Wimsey replied with a faint smile. "But the world, I suspect, will never quite run out of them. One simply has to remain attentive." Merriman House, for all its architectural cunning, taught us that, and one does not forget such lessons easily. Later, when Parker called to offer thanks once more, Wimsey received him with his habitual arch courtesy. "Inspector," he said, "the law has been served, truth has been observed, and silence, I think, has learned its limits. One hopes that is sufficient for your purposes." Parker shook his head, a mixture of admiration and exasperation in his glance. "It always amazes me, Wimsey, how you see what others overlook, how the smallest detail can unravel the greatest mystery." Wimsey allowed a faint, ironic smile. "Attention, patience, and a careful ear, Inspector. That is the sum of it. And, perhaps, the faintest sense of amusement when human nature obligingly reveals itself." As Parker departed, Wimsey returned to the window, looking out over London's grey roofs and chimneys. Somewhere beyond the fog and frost, people lived, worked, and deceived one another in quiet, ordinary ways. And somewhere, perhaps, a clock ticked ever so slightly out of alignment, a door whispered when closed, and silence awaited the observant ear. Wimsey lit his pipe and leaned back, allowing the smoke to curl lazily toward the ceiling. "The world," he murmured to himself, "will always have its secrets. But it is the privilege of the patient, the perceptive, and the meticulous to interpret them, and occasionally to enjoy the clarity when the last echo fades." And with that, awed Peter Wimsey rose, straightened his collar, and strolled into the study, the faint sound of his footsteps punctuating the quiet as if to say, simply and archly, that the game was played, the puzzle solved, and the world's intricate little truths could, for now, rest beneath his calm, attentive gaze. The bells of distant churches tolled on, indifferent to human affairs, while in the rooms of Merriman House the velvet curtains hung quietly, the clocks ticked their reconciled rhythms, and the faintest whisper of truth lingered in the air. Patient, precise, and at last fully revealed, the case was closed, the world continued, and Lord Peter Wimsey, as ever, remained alert, amused, and quietly triumphant.